Alexander, back up here for a second day in a row. For those of you that missed her research presentation yesterday, Alana is a Rutherford postdoctoral scholar at the University of Otago in New Zealand, and she also finished her PhD here at OSU in 2014 in Scott Baker's lab. So we're happy to have her back and imparting some wisdom about navigating challenges facing early career research.
All right, the green light. Thanks so much for that introduction, Dawn, and thanks for making the coffee for the folks who've turned up today. Okay, so I actually gave this talk at the start of this year, and my brief was to try and talk about experiences in terms of challenges that early career researchers face. So I think the first question is, why me? Which sounds a bit existential. So I'm not going to tell you that I'm necessarily a successful early career researcher, but I will tell you that I have been successful at remaining an early career researcher. And if you go from the start of my beginning of my PhD, this is my 11th year at it. So don't rely on me for advice on how to get to the next stage of your career, but I can talk about the challenges that early career researchers face until the cows come home. So I just wanted to give you a little of my life cycle so you know where I'm coming from. So after hatching, I spent a lot of my childhood just going down and poking the poor little creatures that lived in rock pools. So that was my first introduction to biology. And I was very interested in marine biology from an early age. I did my undergrad at the University of Auckland, where it was focused largely on ecology. And it was an interesting challenge as a first generation student, but not one that I'll be talking about today. But just that's something else that can come out a little bit in terms of the challenge that early career researchers face. During my time, I was really lucky to do a couple of internships in Scott's lab. The first I spent in the basement of the School of Biological Sciences, tracing the outline of dorsal fins and of bottlenose dolphins, and that was a great introduction to science in terms of it being mostly really boring with moments of excitement. And it was also quite depressing because I'd be like, yeah, I'm doing this project on dolphins, and people would be really excited for me. I was like, no. Don't be so excited. The next year I came back and I started a genetics project with one of Scott's former PhD students, Susanna, looking at a genus of dolphins, Sotalia, which is found around South America, and trying to look at whether the what are now known to be different species that are found up the Amazon versus along the coast were different or not, based on a set of markers called AFLPs. So that was really neat because it gave me my first taste of genetics and how useful it could be for looking at species. Following on my honours project, which I did with Scott, during which he moved from the University of Auckland to Oregon State University, leaving me abandoned, with other very competent supervisors who helped look after me, and often very long Skype chats. So I was looking at the effects of mass stranding events on genetic diversity in long-fin pilot whales. So I went out with Rochelle Constantine, who was one of my my big mentors during my whole scientific career. I'm just going to go out and say it. It's not just my undergrad. I went out with her to do some research in the Bay of Islands on these bottlenose dolphins, and that's when I realised my dreams of being like a Jacques Cousteau figure were in tatters because I got seasick, which was quite depressing, but that's okay. You know, one door closes, another opens. And that was doing genetic research on whales and dolphins. So this was much more optimal from not throwing out my lunch perspective, and it was a really neat way to figure out what I wanted to do. So one of my big pieces of advice, particularly for students who are maybe still in their masters or undergrad, is try and do a bunch of little interns. It's really good for figuring out what you like and what you don't like before you commit a major chunk of your life to it. If you're already a PhD student, sorry. This advice has come too late for you. So after that, my big move was up here to Hatfield Marine Science Centre at Oregon State University to do my PhD. And I'd really like to acknowledge Fulbright's funding here. As an international student, it's very unlikely I would have been able to come up here and do a PhD without that funding. So that covered me for my first 3 years of the PhD, and in the remaining 3 years I did a lot of teaching assistantships and helped teach Scott's whales and whaling paper for the full 6 years, because no one comes to the United States to do a quick PhD, it turns out. So my PhD is actually where I got my first taste of working in the command line. So I was the first student in the lab to get back next generation sequencing data, which is a bunch of data, huge files in text-based format. So we were used to in the lab going through and checking a lot of our results by eye to make sure that they made sense. You couldn't do that with these, 3 gigabase files. You'd be there forever. So it was necessary to become conversant in the command line. And what was neat is just that little bit of experience in today's terms got me my postdoc position at the University of Kansas, where I was then a genomics specialist, which was a big step up. It was a neat experience. I got to walk in underneath this mosasaur skeleton every day. I literally had the keys to the Natural History Museum there, which was pretty cool. Because there weren't that many people doing whale and dolphin research out there, I ended up branching out and working on a few other credits. My next move was back down to the University of Otago, where I'm in the Department of Anatomy, which may seem like a very weird fit for someone with my background, but it turns out that my boss there is not really a proper anatomist and actually is probably a zoologist in disguise. So his research uses a lot of interesting model systems to try, not really model systems, non-model species that he's curbing into model systems to try and look at insights about reproductive biology and development. So working on Hector's and Maui dolphins there is probably not even the most strange thing that's going on in the lab at the moment, because he's just been over at Loch Ness trying to use eDNA to discover what Nessie is. So right now my current project is working on the Rutherford. Okay, so my first challenge getting this talk together is how do you even structure a talk like this? So I thought I would lean into being a millennial. So along with loving trophies for very mediocre accomplishments, not being able to afford houses because we eat too much avocado and toast, being precious snowflakes, millennials love listicles. So the real title of this talk is Here Are 10 Challenges of Being an Early Career Researcher You Probs Already Know About. And I think the real reason that I wanted to give this talk is part of being an early career researcher is feeling like you're the only person who's going through these challenges. And I think it's really important to talk with other people about how you're not the only one, you're not a failure, everyone feels like this at some time. So the first one is always feeling like you're behind. So the worst way that this manifests for me currently is when I wake up at about 2 in the morning, I'm just sitting there going, oh, it's going to be nice to sleep for another few hours, and then you start feeling about all the projects that you're behind on, and then you're bolt awake, freaking out about how you're never going to get that paper finished, your heart rate jolts, and you never get back to sleep. And then you're worrying about not getting back to sleep, and it's just this vicious cycle. So my current solution to this is to get up and just do an hour on whatever is freaking me out the most until I'm tired enough to go back to sleep. But I think we can all agree that that's not an optimal way to live one's life. But there was actually a moment during my PhD that was probably worse in terms of being behind, and that was during my first semester of my PhD. I was traveling back and forth to Corvallis for coursework, and I was trying to get started on research, and I was finding it very difficult to balance those time commitments. So my helpful lab manager, and the names are redacted here to protect the innocent, although most of you will know who these people are, sent me this email saying, how are those assignments going? Hope you finished them today. Might have a bit of work to do for the rest of the week, and next week, and the 2 after. The PI will be in touch soon. So I set myself up to reply with this email. Like you'll actually be ringing me, do I need to have my phone on? Or is it more like you have all of this lab work to do and you are not doing it type of thing? First assignment is about a quarter done, I'm on track. But you know that thing where you're thinking about someone in an email, but not necessarily intending to send the email back to that person, but to the person who originally emailed you? Yeah. Hi Alana, for lab meeting tomorrow, can you prepare a plan and schedule for finishing the primary sperm whale analysis in the next 2 weeks? Also please review our agreement with key collaborator. With you heading home for holidays in 4 weeks and helpful lab manager away for 2 months, I am really concerned that we fulfill our primary obligations to key collaborator. Cheers, the PI. So after sending a suitably apologetic email to both my PI and our wonderful lab manager, and getting a schedule together, I did what any fully adult person does in this situation. I emailed my mum. I thought this would make you laugh. I sent an email to the PI I intended to send to help the lab manager about how slack I am being about not doing lab work. How embarrassing! It is true though. I need to do more. Sigh. When am I going to fit it in, Mum? Hi Alana. I recommend that you start juggling now, and by the end of your PhD, you will have an alternate job skill and therefore other employment prospects. Still wish I had the opportunities you do, sigh. So apart from realising that my mum is really good at throwing shade, there were a number of really important things that kind of came out in this email. The first off, she's not wrong. Having a broad CV does help with job prospects, although I definitely cannot juggle. But perhaps more importantly, it was perspective. So I was in this middle of having this big freak out about how I might have been crashing and burning my relations, and she was saying, I've got this wonderful opportunity to do research that she never had, so make the most of it. And that's really important to have. So feeling that research is deep down your passion is something to hold on to, even if you might not see it right then in that moment. As well as being important to maintain your own internal perspective, it's also important to realise that you're not alone. Everyone feels behind. So I suspect one way to feel less like time is running through your fingers is to be good at time management. But as we've talked about, my time management system is working on whatever is making me panic the most at that moment. So I'm not a good person to take advice from. So what's really good is for you guys to chat to your peers and find out what systems have been working best for them for managing their time. But some things I know are really important for managing time are trying to get a handle on analysing your data in an automated fashion. So obviously, as a geeky person who does bioinformatics and coding, that's important. It's also important to try and balance preparation for experiments with actually doing the experiments. And I often end up too much on the preparation side, I think. The problem with this is this quote here. So reagents are expensive, things explode, people explode. Research is about balancing preparation and planning with doing. If you do too much of the former, you realise what you would want to do will never work and won't move forward. If you do the latter, then you end up wading through a lot of data and peer mediation discussions trying to figure out what is going wrong. So you've got to try and balance those two very different frames of mind. Okay, so one place where I know that I am actually better than the average bear is keeping up with literature, because that is a skill set I have tried to work on. So I've got a few tips and tricks that I found handy for this. One is to try and sign up for literature tables of contents from journals that you're interested in. And that way, whenever they come out, you'll be alerted of the new cool articles in your field. The next is setting up a Google Scholar profile, because you can get alerts back about relevant literature. This is also really important if you're on the job market. If people find out that you've got a Google Scholar profile, they can click on you and see what papers you've authored in a really easy manner. So I'd highly recommend that if you're on the job market. I use the forward plus back approach for a comprehensive literature review, which sounds really complex, but basically if I find a paper I really like, I plug its title into Google Scholar, and I find all the articles that have since cited that first paper. So that's the forward approach. And then you can also go down the bibliography of your paper of interest and find all the previous papers that you probably should have read already as well. You do that until you've got about 200 tabs open and your lab mates get very nervous looking over at your computer. If you're off campus, make sure you follow the tips at the library site in order to be able to access those papers if you hit the paywall. You should be never paying for literature. You can also request any articles you can't get access to, and the library will magically make it happen for you. They prefer that to using certain Ukraine and Russian-based sites for sharing literature, because if they have the request in their system, they know specific journals that are of interest. And Jeanette?
I was also going to point out that you can email authors and ask them. They often love to share their PDFs. So.
Excellent. So Anjanette just suggested you can also email authors, for those of you guys who are not in the room. And yes, they're very happy to share their literature. And also signing up and becoming memberships of your favourite academic societies will give you access to their journals.
Very cheap for
and I hear the American Genetic Association is a great society to sign up to.
And many papers are not behind a paywall. For some journal publications after a year or
That's a great point, yeah. So yeah, looking for open access options. So there's a great set of tips here at this article. One of the big ones which I liked was a quote from a researcher who says that whenever he finds articles of interest that he thinks other people would be relevant to their research, he shoots those papers off to them, and he hopes that in return they'll do the same. They'll go, oh yeah, that person's interested in Maui and Hector's dolphin genetic research. I wonder if they've seen this paper, and shoots it back to them. And that's a great way to try and keep up with the literature, because if you've missed anything, hopefully people are thinking of you when they're reading through those table of contents. Okay, practicing time management. I'm going to move on to the next point, which is when you are not working, you feel guilty. So this can be about normal day-to-day things that most people don't worry about, like fitting in time to cook food and eat and exercise, because what's good for your heart is good for your brain, and see friends, and sort of things that, you know, like a normal human would consider worthy of their time. But it's also something that can strike when you take larger chunks of time off. But these are really important to do because you can't redline your brain for 365 days a year. You have to take those breaks and allow yourself to recharge. One recent case for me was when my husband Ryan and I went to Rocky Mountain National Park for 6 whole days in 2017. Oh boy, that's a lot of time off work. This was particularly important for us because we were living in 2 different locations at the time, so it was a nice way to be able to see each other. But also, I think perspective again is really important. If I'd been hit by a car after this holiday, I would not have regretted missing 6 days of work. If I'd chosen not to go on the holiday and got hit by a car, I would be regretting having been at work for those 6 days and not having gone on the holiday. So I don't really have necessarily a lot of silver bullets for this one, other than to say you might feel a little bit guilty, but you should probably take the break anyway. And if you guys have got other solutions for trying to deal with feeling guilty about not doing research, yeah, again, talk to each other. You're going to have great solutions. Okay, this next one's a big one, and it's one that is actually so prevalent there's even a body of research into it, and that is imposter syndrome. So this is when you feel like you shouldn't even be here in research. For me, this has started striking a little bit less the further on in my career I've gone, because as a scientist I know the fact that I keep on progressing in my career probably isn't just due to luck, because the chances of that get smaller and smaller the longer you stay in science. So you're clearly doing something that means you should belong here. However, during my PhD it would definitely hit really hard if I had a setback in lab work or an analysis I couldn't get to work or things like that. So what I'm going to say is that you don't have to be perfect to be an early career researcher, and you shouldn't be comparing yourself to perfection, because that's absolutely crazy. And you shouldn't be comparing yourself to people who are further ahead in their career than you, because they've had more time to accrue those accomplishments. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to throw up some of my big achievements. This is not to humble brag, but just to show you that it's more about grit and persistence than it is about some kind of amazing innate talent. So one of my big achievements was getting my PhD after 6 years, as Scott pointed out yesterday. I got lapped by another PhD student in the lab. There was a PhD student in the lab, Becca, who started, no names, but Becca, it was Becca. She started a year after me, and she finished a year before me. But I still got the same old piece of paper she did. So it's not a race. You take the time to do the research you need to do. Another big achievement I've had recently was getting the Rutherford postdoctoral fellowship, which is somewhat equivalent to an NSF postdoc award up here. I originally submitted a similar proposal for something that was a little bit more similar to the NSF Early Career Award, and it got bounced really hard. Like, it got rejected without any doubt that it was getting rejected. I took the feedback on my chin and I reformatted it and I submitted it for the Rutherford Fellowship and got that. So it can be very difficult to take those knocks, but if you persist and take into account feedback, you can get there. So it's not about being perfect, it's about learning your lessons and trying to persist. But that brings me on to my next point, which is everybody's a critic. I should point out that my PI did not actually say this about my PhD at all, but he definitely wasn't a fan of some of the language that I used in one particular chapter. And I maintain the record of being the only student who's ever had a WTF written on any of my drafts, which I think is pretty amazing. And it actually made for a great 60th birthday present, because I found a stamp on Amazon which would stop him from having to write it out on any more of my writing. So my joking around is not to say that rejection can't be super tough. It really can be. You can pour your heart and soul into a piece of writing and think it's really neat, and then someone can eviscerate it. But it makes your stuff better, as hard as it can be to receive. I do have a few hints for making the review process a little smoother. And if you guys have additional advice, again, pass it around. The first of my points is version control. So try not to do what this PhD comic on the right is doing here, where you're naming your versions of your drafts in somewhat incomprehensible fashion. Also back up. Don't be the student who has to rewrite their whole thesis from a previously printed version. That was not me, but I believe that was Franz, wasn't it? Yeah. So syncing your documents and making sure they're backed up in a few different places is super critical, and the same thing for your data. If you're sending your stuff off to folks to give you feedback, be specific about what you want from them. So do you want them to look at the overall structure? Do you want them to go down into the weeds? Where is your manuscript going? So that's going to be really important for them to know what kind of feedback they're going to give to you. And let them know when you need the revisions by. Also, give them a bit of time. I mean, this is a really tricky thing because your own writing is obviously the most important thing to you. But I can guarantee it's only one of a bazillion things that they're juggling, and they have to fit in time for your revisions. So giving folks a few weeks to really be able to look at your work is important. If folks have given you feedback, please take the time to let them know that you've got it and that you appreciate it. This is grumpy old Alana shaking her fist here, but doing a good read through takes a lot of time. And if I send it off to folks and don't hear anything, I'm like, did it get trapped in their spam filter? Did they even get it? So just acknowledging that folks have spent a bit of time on it is important. And in that respect, make sure that you've got a lot of the easy to eliminate errors out of the way. So do a spell check. One of my big things is I'm very poor when I read through in my head of picking up on done language mistakes. So the form versus the from, that's a big one. I've started using, on Macs, there's an accessibility function that will read your document back to you. And on Microsoft Word, I believe there's a read aloud function as well. And that's helped me pick up a lot of my more poor language that I have not picked up when I'm reading through it. So making sure that you've done those sort of really fiddly things so that folks can really focus on what's the important part of your writing and your ideas. Line numbers. There are a few horrible journals out there that do not require you to submit your manuscripts with line numbers. Please use them anyway. And if you can use line numbers that actually match up to the lines, that's also appreciated, because as a reviewer it takes a lot more time to write out the sentences that you're referring to rather than going, page 3, line 1, here's the problem I've got here. Thank the reviewers. Sometimes this is hard. Sometimes reviewer 3 has been words that I'm not going to say on a recorded lecture that will be available for, the whole of history. You've got to thank them anyway. If they know that that you appreciate their time that they put into the review, it will go more smoothly on re-review, even if you secretly hope you never ever met them in real life. What I should say here too is I've put up a whole bunch of cutesy cartoons here, and that can serve to, I think, minimize a little bit of the stresses that we do go through as early career researchers. So if you ever find that this is too much, especially if you're the one of 6 of us who are going through additional mental health challenges, make sure you use the services that are available for you. So at Oregon State, there's CAPS for students, and then for worker bees, there's the employee assistant program. And talk to your other grads. Let people know what's going on if you're having difficulty. Okay, so reviewer 3 being a whatever word we want to put in there. Leads me on to people not playing nice. So in an ideal world, we'd treat all of our colleagues with respect and we would be kind to others who we interact with. But unfortunately, there are a lot of really strong power differentials at play, especially as an early career researcher, and that can make it pretty easy to be the victim of some not so nice behaviour that can come your way. I don't have any strong solution to this one, other than to say I tend to put people on fade if I find them unpleasant to work with, and try never to work with them again after those projects are over and done with. But potentially a better solution is to try not to have those people in your life in the first place. This is particularly important when you're choosing PhD and postdoc mentors, because these people are going to have a very strong effect on your ongoing career and how comfortable you feel like in science. So before you commit to a lab, talk to the other folks who are in that lab. Find out what kind of lab it is, whether you think it would be a good fit for you. Especially pay attention if they seem like they don't really want to discuss what's going on in the lab, because that can make it seem like they're perhaps not very comfortable with that lab environment. Most good labs to be in will be quite open and good at communicating. Politics is part of every workplace, and that's just one of those things. Some people are going to not like each other, and there's not a lot you can do about that. But the ability to treat people courteously, even if they're not your favourite human in the world, is really important. There are a number of new initiatives, including kindness in science, which is cool. They're basically talking about the fact you don't need to be a cutthroat, ruthless human to succeed in research. Kindness is entirely compatible with a successful scientific career. Before I go on, what I would like to also say is if you're the victim of discrimination on any prohibited grounds of harassment, such as sexuality, gender, religion, that kind of thing, don't accept that. That's something that's never okay. And I think it's the ethical behaviour policy site, Oregon State's website, has more information on things that you can do to try and report instances of harassment. Okay, one of the other reasons I think sometimes people aren't kind in science is because there's a lot of feeling that you're in a cutthroat world where you're competing for small slices of a funding pie. And in my experience, what can actually be useful is to be collaborative and open about what your research is. And in that regard, you can make the pie bigger and have a really cool project that is actually enriched by those collaborations. But the restricted funding is something that I'm going to come on to on the next point, which is funding can be hard to come by. So this is true both for research grants, but also true for stipends. I remember being a grad student and just hoping my car wouldn't break down because I wasn't going to be able to afford to fix it if it did. So being a grad student is tough. I don't have any good solutions for this other than if your supervisor offers to pay for lunch, let them. They're getting paid a lot more than you. Also, I know that Hatfield has cookies at seminar. It has donuts on Wednesdays still, right? Yeah. Make sure you know where all those free food opportunities are, and take opportunity to use them. But the research funding is a big challenge. I found this particularly challenging as a foreign national in the US because a lot of the funding opportunities are only available to US citizens and permanent residents. However, if you want to stick it out in academia, funding is one of those really important things to have on your CV, especially independent funding. So applying for any small pots of money you can get your hands in to show that you're successful at writing grants and obtaining funding is really important. There is a research office at Oregon State funding page, which you can sign up for alerts about funding opportunities that are coming out, and that might be a useful thing for you guys to do, just to think about funding opportunities that could be good to apply for. So that proof of independent funding brings me on to my next point, which is jobs are hard to come by. So I mentioned that demonstrating the ability to get funding is important for trying to progress on the job ladder. And this is difficult because funding rates are low everywhere. It doesn't matter whether you're in New Zealand or the United States. It's hard to get research funding. So one of my big things is because I was a first generation college student, my parents worked jobs to make the ends meet, to get us kids through school. And then what they were very keen on was for us to do jobs that we actually liked, because that's not what they got to do. So they were like, you know what you need to do? You go to school. If you go to school, you'll get the job you want. So I was like, I want to be a university lecturer. That sounds great. And so I progressed through, and it wasn't until I got to the very end I was like, this is a Ponzi scheme. If you want to stay in academia, it can be difficult. And that's because successful PIs are generally successful because they've got a great team who generates a lot of data and publications. And that requires a lot of people at these lower levels. However, all these folks who want to stay in academia, they're all actually competing for that one job at the top of the pile. And how this manifests is, as a consequence, is where people end up in terms of a biology PhD. So at the moment I'm in what I call the permadoc swirl here, where you do some number of postdocs and eventually you get choked off the permadoc merry-go-round, or carousel as that we call it in the States, the carousel of jobs, and you end up in one of these other positions, hopefully. So, academic supervisors are really good at knowing how to be academics, but they're often a little bit less savvy about what other job prospects are out there. And that's really important because we can't all get jobs in academia. It's just a mathematical, unfortunate, or fortunate if you don't want to be an academic, possibility. Okay, so my challenge to any folks who supervise students who are sitting in this room is which one of the students that you've taken on is going to take your role when you retire? Are the other students happy in what they do? If they are, that's awesome. So you don't have to stay in academia to have a very successful, great career. But if you don't know what your students are doing, or if they're happy to be if they are actually happy being in a job that is somewhat unrelated to their degree, then you don't get an extra piece of cake at lunch. Sorry, I'm just going to try and get my list of awesome careers here of my friends who've managed to escape academia. Okay. So, awesome careers that you could do outside of academia, and this is just a small selection. Consultancy and private research firms, self-employed contract working, science teaching, scientific writing, forensics, bioinformatics companies, stay-at-home parents, swimming coaches, working for local government, working for federal research agencies, private ecological monitoring companies, biotech, Google, working for NGOs, working for museums, working for zoos, working for fish and game organisations, working for predator-free initiatives, doing science policy, scientific publishing, and a bunch of other jobs. So you're not limited just to academia. I think some of the angst about leaving academia comes from this idea that you're failing if you leave, because the only place you could possibly do pure research is in an academic environment. And this was a really moving quote from the Chronicle of Higher Ed about a philosophy professor who had tenure, who ended up losing his job because the college simply didn't have enough enrollments. So what it did is gave him a lot of time to spend with one of his former students who was now dying of cancer. And there was a quote in it that really struck me. What's best about the academic life, pursuing truth, following one's interests, working through ideas with other curious people, doesn't happen only on the campus, in the classroom, or with the safety of a tenure-track professorship. Investigating, sharing, and learning happen at home, on a lunch break in the passenger seat of a delivery truck, or while holding a friend's hand in a hospice bedroom. The only real failure is forgetting these possibilities. There was also this other article that I found really interesting, which was about a person who'd gone to grad school, had left academia because she couldn't get a job, and did not regret it one bit, because the intellectual experience of doing a PhD was so enriching for her. And I actually agree with this. I think I would not swap my PhD for anything. It was such an awesome experience. But I do feel like PIs, especially with first generation students, do need to be a little bit open about what your degree is going to get you in terms of employment prospects. Okay, so I've just gone very glum on what academia is likely to be for most folks. But I know there's going to be a number of people who are like, I hear what you say, but I'm going to do it anyway. And this is the bit where you really, really have to take my advice with a grain of salt, because I haven't got a permanent academic job. But from my perspective, what it takes to go from a PhD to a postdoc and a postdoc to a permanent position seem to be along the following lines. Thinking ahead. Starting to apply for jobs at least a year out from when your current position ends, or when you're estimated to complete your PhD. The reason for this is that the wheels of academia turn very, very slowly. It can take a while to get your job application materials together, especially for those first few jobs, and they often take a lot of incremental fiddling to get nibbles from the job market. Okay, you need to work on your CV. You might not have independent funding and publications straight out of your PhD, and that's cool. Just make sure that it is a priority to work on during your first postdoc. Learn new skills that are going to be in demand by departments. Mine's tended to be bioinformatics, which has ended up being a very hot area to be in, just through pure luck, not because I designed it to be that way. It's not what you know, it's who you know. So there'll be a lot of opportunities that are broadcast on listservs that you'll see, but there are a lot of opportunities that don't even make it to listservs, which are just word of mouth. I've got this cool PhD student, there'd be an awesome postdoc for you. That means you have to network your weaselly little heart out. It's awful networking, especially when you're early on in your career and you don't know a lot of people. It's super awkward being at conferences and walking up to people and saying, hi, I really like your work. You have to do it anyway. What I will tell you is that as you go on your career, it becomes a lot easier to network, because it just turns out it's hanging out with people you know from your previous positions in different areas of the globe. So it's just catching up with old friends. Set up collaborations, so work with folks. Obviously your PhD project should be your main focus, but if you've got the opportunity to do little side projects with folks from other labs, that's really valuable too, and expands out your network. Promote yourself. If you're looking for a job, let people know that you're looking for a job. Get other people to look at your job materials. Mine were greatly improved by having both Kathleen and Scott go through them and make sure that I was hitting the notes that they would be looking for if they were hiring. And if you do manage to stick it out in academia, make sure that you give these same sort of talks to your own students. Okay, so I mentioned networking is just meeting up with people that you've known from previous places, and it brings us on to challenge number 8, which is opportunities are geographically disparate. So to get what you want and get the job you're likely to want, it's going to mean probably moving. And along with this comes with a lot of the things that people who've moved around know about. Homesickness, culture shock, loneliness, and financial strain. The first 3 were things that I experienced moving from the US to New Zealand, which is superficial, no, other way around, New Zealand to the US. Although I then did move back to New Zealand. The culture shock there was no drive-through coffee. Anyway, yeah, I experienced this even though the cultures are very superficially similar between the two areas. So there were a lot of times where I was like, I've made a terrible mistake moving halfway around the world to do this. Like, what was I thinking? The biggest solution I found in my moves is to try and put down roots as quickly as possible. So put yourself out there a little bit more than you normally would to make friends, volunteer, start up local activities that make you feel connected to that place. Obviously, it can be a lot more difficult if you've got dependents, because then you have their potential social isolation as a factor as well. So it's a very tricky thing with not a lot of solutions, I think. The financial strain I'm going to speak to here. This is my Lab Cross St. Bernard rescue from the Humane Society shelter in Kansas, and he is sitting in the back of the truck in a parking lot in Houston waiting to be shipped down to New Zealand after my husband and I already drove him down from Kansas to Texas, Kansas where I'd finished my postdoc, to Texas where Ryan was currently working. Between shipping the dog and shipping all of our stuff to New Zealand, our double income savings was completely wiped out. And the dog also cost 2 orders of magnitude more to ship than the adoption fees from the shelter. So afterwards, I will take guesses on how much money that was to ship that dog. But it's expensive, and if you've got kids and things like that, it's much more expensive, and it's definitely a strain. However, the flip side is that there are a bunch of benefits. Some of them are Machiavellian, like expanding your network, but on a more fundamental and human level, it allows you to have this richness of experience where you get to meet amazing people from amazing places. This is a bit of a bittersweet benefit, and this was a quote that I ended up sticking in my acknowledgements of my thesis. You will never be completely at home again because part of your heart will always be elsewhere. That is the price you pay for the richness of loving and knowing people in more than one place. Okay, so moving around brings me on to my next set of problems, which is the two-body or nobody problem. So opportunities being in different places and what can be quite a single-minded pursuit of research and being paid quite poorly can make it difficult to convince someone to share your life with them. Like they're like, actually, you know what, I'm holding out for that oil billionaire. You're not really the best decision. So when this manifests in folks being single when they would rather not be, this is the nobody problem. But you know who it can be quite easy to convince being a researcher is cool? Other researchers. But this has an entirely different problem because it turns out getting 2 research jobs in the same location can be quite difficult. So this leads to what I'm more familiar with recently, which is the two-body problem. So Ryan and I met in grad school when we were based here at Hatfield Marine Science Centre, and that was cool. And then in 2012 he defended his master's and he moved to Portland, which, as you guys know, it's probably not a daily commute you want to be doing from Newport. So instead what happened is I would come down to Newport for the weeks and then I would commute back up to Portland in the weekend. In 2013 we got married despite being largely based in separate places, which I do not recommend as a wedding planning technique. And then in 2014 I had finished my lab work. So what happened then is I was riding up from Portland and then driving down and back up in a single day for any lab meetings or meetings that I had to be at. That's fine, 6 hours is all good. Then halfway through September 2014, I defended my thesis, and 2 weeks later, my folks, Ryan and I, were in our blue Xterra towing a U-Haul trailer with an advanced load of stuff out to Lawrence, Kansas. So this is a 26-hour drive by the fastest route one way, so it was definitely not a commute we would be doing even on the weekends, it turned out. So what happened is Ryan flew out a few times for the remainder of the year, but it wasn't actually that long until we were in the same place again, just 4 months. So I flew back to Portland, we loaded up the rest of the stuff, and we drove out to Kansas. However, this may shock you guys, but Kansas is a terrible place for a marine fisheries biologist to find employment. So poor Ryan stuck it out doing seasonal jobs for the Kansas equivalent of ODF and W for about a year, and then filling in the gaps at Home Depot because we needed the money, which was slowly eating away at his soul. And for me, as the leading spouse, it seemed unfair that the trailing spouse was sacrificing their career in that respect. So we decided together that Ryan should start applying for jobs other places. And he got a job as an ecosystem biologist down in coastal Texas. which was only a 13-hour drive each way. So that's not bad at all in comparison. I-35 is the worst, most boring interstate in America. I apologize for anyone who lives along there, but guys, how do you even do it? Anyway, so it was actually good because it was a demonstration of true love, and I'll come back to that in a few moments. So what we would do is we'd take turns to take a long weekend, about once a month, and we would drive each way. But of course, like that's really not that great for long distance. If you want to go long distance, you should commit. So we committed to long distance, like, go big or go home. So my visa was up. I had to move back to New Zealand. And we'd done the move before where Ryan hadn't had a good job to come to. So what we thought we'd do this time is we'd stay long distance, try and sort out Ryan some employment that he was going to enjoy before he committed to moving down. In the meantime, we also got Ryan's visa application in for a permanent residency. And this was complicated by the fact that we'd spent so much time living in different locations. We looked like visa fraud. Like, we looked like the exact example of a visa fraud. But I-35 saved us. In our 73-page dossier declaring our love to each other, I think the thing that's probably stood out the most is no one would ever choose to drive I-35 optionally for 13 hours unless it was for true love. Fortunately, all the cold calling, emailing, all the stuff we did to try and find Ryan paid off, and his residency came through. And in September 2018, he moved down to New Zealand. So back in January when I first gave this talk, I tallied up the time Ryan and I had spent in the same or different places, and 42% of the time we were living in different places from our relationship up to that point. Long distance doesn't work for everyone, I'm not going to lie. It worked for us because we spent a lot of time on Skype, and it was just something that we felt supported enough to do by our respective families and friends. I've known people who have found that they've pushed long distance for too long, and it's caused their relationships to break down. So I don't have any silver bullets for this either, other than to tell you it's one of the very difficult things about competing life priorities. So it turns out most people want more in their life than just to go to work, eat, go home, sleep, and repeat for the whole lives. But balancing big life decisions about marriage, house ownership, and having kids can be very difficult with an active research career. One of the big difficulties I found is the idea about having kids, because I grew up without much money, and as a postdoc whose contract will end at some point, the idea of having a child who's dependent on me when I'm unemployed is somewhat terrifying, because I know what it's like to be a kid in a family that doesn't have much money. But also reproductive biology says, I can't put off that decision forever, so maybe I'm going to have to make a decision at some point. But what I will say is it's up to you to make the decision about how you want to spend your life. Yes, careers are important to a lot of people. That's shown by the green pie here. But it's up to you to make a decision about how small or big that green pie is in comparison with the rest of your competing life priorities. And you just have to do you. Don't let other people tell you what should be important to you. Okay, so conclusions. You might feel guilty, or you can always feel behind, but so does everyone else. You might feel guilty when you're not working, but take the break anyway. You don't have to be perfect to be an early career researcher. Everybody's a critic, but feedback does make your stuff better. Try and avoid people who don't play nice. Funding can be hard to come by. Try again. Jobs can be hard to come by in academia. Think ahead or think outside the box. Get out. Opportunities are geographically disparate, but that leads you to encounter some amazing people in some amazing places. The two-body or no-body problem, I don't know what to tell you about this one other than it sucks. And competing life priorities, and you just need to do what makes you happy. So that's a lot of like really depressing real talk, but I think we need to focus on how awesome science is. So every day we get to come into work, shine the torch into the dark corners of the unknown, and add a little bit of more knowledge to the world, and that is a very precious and pure calling. So, chin up. So this is a bit different to one of those normal research presentations where you thank all the folks who helped you on the project. So instead I'm going to do a very broad thank you to folks who have provided me with some of the experiences I've leaned on for this talk. So that includes friends, family and colleagues, and I've managed to get a very small selection on that slide there. The amazing mentors and PIs I've been lucky enough to have during my career who've informed my development greatly as a scientist, particularly the PI. And finally, all the funding organisations who've helped me get through school and to fund the project that I've been working on. And I'm happy to take any questions. or discussions?
Go ahead.
Oh, no.
As someone who's finishing up a chapter that was based in New Zealand and going back and forth, what are the biggest differences you see in academic culture between Oregon or the U.S. and New Zealand?
It's a great question. We were actually just talking about that before the talk. So there's huge differences in how the PhD is set up between the different countries. So a PhD in New Zealand is quite short. It's generally 3 years, research only. You don't get a lot of opportunity to teach. You don't get a lot of opportunity to publish as you go. But you get out quicker. So the difference in how the PhDs are supervised is quite a big one too. So in New Zealand you have a primary supervisor and often maybe a few co-supervisors, but you don't have like the committee aspect that you have in the US PhD system. On the other side, your PhDs in New Zealand are externally assessed, which I think is actually a nice thing for ensuring scientific rigor. Your committee in the US has a vested interest in you actually graduating, believe it or not. It doesn't look great on their CV to have a student who didn't make it. However, the US has the public defense, which I think is awesome. Like getting up to talk about your research and what you've done for the last, 6 years in my case, is great. You're getting to inform people a lot about that. In terms of the actual research environment, New Zealand's a long way away. It's a small country. It's about the same size as Oregon. So access to technology is a lot more difficult than in the US. So I found it much easier to do a next generation sequencing project as a student in the US than I think I would have in New Zealand in a similarly funded lab. On the positive side, I think work-life balance is a lot more prioritized in New Zealand than it is in the US. It's a little bit more of a happy-go-lucky country, and so it's accepted that you're going to be taking time off to do things. There's there is funding for maternity leave, which is completely different to the US, where there is no federally funded maternity leave or sick leave. They're both, I think, great countries to do research if you have the means to do it. But one of the big ones is research funding, which getting a Marsden in New Zealand is about as difficult as getting an NSF research grant in the States. The funding rates are quite low, and I think we lose a lot of talent to folks who decide that that's not for them. The uncertainty of going from soft money to soft money contract is quite difficult. Great question. Scott?
Well, my question was really just, do you think universities are doing enough to support postdoctoral fellows and all the complexity of
I think there needs to be a better pathway for postdocs to transition to permanent research jobs. Doesn't necessarily need to be tenure track, but it could be things like scientific officers, which maybe don't give you the pay and prestige of being tenure track, but allow you some security of knowing where you're going to be in the next 5 years. And that's actually another big difference between New Zealand and the US is postdoc funding rates. So despite the fact New Zealand's smaller and everything tends to be way more expensive down there, I had a 10K US pay rise going from doing a postdoc in the US to New Zealand. So postdoc funding, postdoc salaries in New Zealand and Australia are much higher than in the US and the UK. So that's something to think about if you are able to travel, like maybe go where some of the money is. But yeah, I think I think that there are too many PhD students being produced for the jobs that we have available unless we start thinking a bit more broadly about what skills you're getting in your PhD and how to translate them to careers outside of academia. And you get a throttle when it goes into the postdoc positions because not every PhD student makes it into a postdoc. And then there's another further throttle from the postdocs going into actually secure funding that allows them to make some of those difficult life choices. Cheryl?
I was wondering, as an early career scientist, how you have or haven't used social media and if you have any particular platforms useful with research data or Twitter.
Yeah, that's a great question. So social media, getting your research out there is really important. It's a good way to let the public know that their taxpayer dollars are going to good use. And it's something that can actually put you in the running for awards. So one of the other postdocs in my lab recently got the Callahan Medal for Science Communication down in New Zealand. Her social media game is great because she had 8 years in the PR industry before she came back to science. So she is completely uniquely suited to it. I only just got on Twitter in the last year because I'm a bit of a technological Luddite, despite being able to do command line coding all that side I'm not very good at. I found Twitter actually probably the most useful platform because it's very easy to pick up new research that's coming out, what people think about it, and it's been really useful for me to connect to other communities I'm involved in, like the Māori community, the Indigenous people in New Zealand. So I think Twitter is probably worth people's time. It's annoying being on another social media platform because I feel like it's another thing to check, but Twitter definitely. There are some Facebook groups that are useful to be involved in, like there's a few STEM groups. What was the other one that you mentioned, Cheryl? ResearchGate. I found ResearchGate really handy for letting people get some of my publications. So it's been handy for disseminating research to folks who have hit the paywalls themselves, but I don't think I utilize ResearchGate how the best way, basically. I think I see people who are a lot more actively on there and it's almost like a Twitter stream just for science. So I think one of the tricky things is the critical mass. And it seems like a lot of people got onto academia.edu rather than ResearchGate, and unless you've got all the people you want to follow in one spot, it's tricky. But I think, yeah, there's a lot of, at least in New Zealand, a fair bit of training offered for SciComm and using media to disseminate research. And I assume there's something similar up here. In the old days, Nescent would have probably been the organisation to go to for it, but I'm not sure who would be good to look at now. That would be a good thing to look up. I can let you know if I find anything. Antoinette.
I was just going to suggest that people, you talk about going to conferences and talking to people at conferences, and I mean, you should go to the big conferences because you meet a lot of people, but they can be so overwhelming. So watch for smaller regional conference. There's one that's for West Coast evolutionary biology, DEVO, but and ours, American Genetic Association, if that's your field, but just the smaller ones, I mean, you really get to talk to people, and plus a lot of the smaller societies have funding to help you go, or free registration or so on.
Yeah, and that's a great point. Like I think in AFS has local chapter meetings, so that's
Right.
for those of us who are more fisheries minded, that's a great one to go to. And it's also often the smaller ones are a little bit more of a gentle experience when you're first presenting your research, because the people who go are you know, they are often bigwigs, but they're bigwigs who are interested in their local students and local communities. So they are capable of giving feedback that doesn't leave you wanting to run to the bathroom and cry in a stall afterwards, which is nice. Yeah.
Have you ever felt it was such a difficult decision to make living in New Zealand or US permanently?
Oh, yeah. So the question is it? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So if you marry someone from a different country, one of the unfortunate realities is someone is not at home, right? Someone is always away from where they grew up, and that's tricky. I obviously love living in New Zealand. I think Ryan's found it okay. It's different. It's different to the US. I know that I'd be happy living in Oregon because I've lived here before. Kansas was great as an experience. But I don't know if I'd ever want to live there permanently. It's a long way away from the ocean, it turns out, and I quite like the ocean. Texas, because I was down there a fair bit when Ryan was there, it was also lovely, but full of mosquitoes and so humid, so humid. So it's, I think one of the big considerations for us is it'd be nice to have the choice of choosing where to live based on location and other aspects, but in reality, we'll go where we can get one of us can get a permanent job. That's what makes our decision. So, yeah. The luxury of choice isn't really there if what's determining where you are is where you can get a position. Yeah.
I mean, how about your family route, your culture?
Oh, well, yeah, so one of the nice things about my family is my mum loves to travel, so she's not that upset if we go a long way away. My dad actually told my mum he hopes we move back to the US because he's had his eye on my dog for a long time. Abe is actually his favourite family member, and what he kind of hopes is if we were to move back to the US, we wouldn't be spending the money to ship the dog back up to the US, and instead he would get to live out his days with Dad. So my family travels quite a bit. It's I think more difficult on Ryan's side because his mum's only surviving child, so obviously she would like it a lot more if Ryan was close to her. But I think if we were to end up living in New Zealand permanently, I suspect Barb would move down to us. So it's we're all about the chain migration to New Zealand, it turns out. But yeah, no, it's a tricky one. And obviously we're lucky enough that we've been paid well enough to travel back up to see parents or travel down to see parents, but it also gets a lot more difficult as your parents age, right? So a lot of the, although my parents are still pretty spry and young, my brother and sister who are closer, if I was up in the States, would bear the brunt of looking after them. And like my little sister is about to have my first niece or nephew in halfway through January, so if we're up in the States, I wouldn't get to see that kid as much. In saying that, we live a 2.5-hour flight away from where the rest of my family is anyway, so it's not like I'm getting to see them on a daily basis in that respect anyway. And it's much the same in the US. It's a huge country. You can be here but not be able to see folks very often at all. So yeah, it's tricky. It would be great if someone was to invent teleportation. That would solve a lot of our problems. I would go to work in Texas and teleport back to New Zealand for the night instead of having to put up with the mosquitoes. Any online one?
We had a handful tuned in, but it looks like no questions.
Cool. Cool. Well, thanks for coming, guys. We appreciate it. Yeah.
For those of you online, we're going to end the program now. If you'd like to see a recording of this, it'll be posted on post-seminar page at the Hatfield website.